that's a good segue into my joke that being heavily invested in war history is worse than being a Nazi. And here it seems I am both.
Oh, man.
According to your Letterboxd reviews. with that said, today Mitchell is on the chopping block. He's going to defend himself because we are talking about, first of all, joined by Zach and Christian, as per usual.
Mm-hmm.
Still don't have a guest. I don't think it's happening this season. But I'm kind of glad there wasn't a guest for this episode. Yeah, we're going to talk about Stalingrad, 1993. Barely ever heard of it. I saw one screen grab of the actor Thomas Kretschmann staring at in the snow, and it was like some meme on the internet, and I forgot what it was. It's like my only exposure to this film prior to watching it today. And it's a war film. It's no negotiating that. It's definitely a German-made war film. It kind of follows this ragtag crew of soldiers in the Wehrmacht, and they had just come from Africa, which is slightly historically inaccurate, but they're an engineer platoon that are assigned new leadership, a new platoon leader, and who's fresh out of his school, and they get sent to Stalingrad with the 6th Army, and takes place from August to December of 1943, and it pretty much just follows their whole devolution and terrible things that happen to them along the way. So, what did you guys think of the movie?
Well, first off, I did want to mention Thomas Kretschmann. That man is Hollywood's favorite Nazi. He's in The Pianist.
Yeah.
He's in Downfall, which isn't a Hollywood movie, but I'm talking general like cinema here. He's in this. Yeah. He's in The First Avenger and a couple other like totally fictional films as a Nazi.
Dial of Destiny.
Dial of Destiny. Yeah.
The man can't get away from it. But anyhow, in terms of the quality of Stalingrad itself, I was underwhelmed by this film, and I was somewhat looking forward to it because I hadn't really heard about this. I hadn't heard that much about this film at all, but it seemed to have a decent reputation. It's got some good actors in it, and I thought, okay, this will at least be interesting. But I was surprised at how my major reaction to this movie was just boredom. And I think the issue really comes down to, and I think this might be one of the reasons that you liked it more than we did, Mitchell, is that the movie, at least for the first 2 acts, seems a lot less interested in the characters and the dynamics of the people, and much more interested in the layout of Stalingrad and the interactions of and these different battles and the relationships between the soldiers and the commanders, the kind of thing that I know that people who are more into the history of these kind of things enjoy more than I do. There's a YouTube channel I quite like called History Buffs, who really, really enjoyed the movie Midway from a few years ago that most critics really didn't enjoy. But they said, oh, well, I love this movie for the reason that most critics dislike most historical movies, because if you want to make a good historically accurate movie, it has to be full of exposition. You have to not really focus on specific characters and emotions that much. And it has to be about the bigger picture instead of the people. And those are kind of all my complaints about this as well. I do think in the 3rd act, it gets a bit better. It starts to focus more on the impact of this conflict on these soldiers and the emotional toll that it's taken on them. But by then, I do think it's kind of too late, because I don't really feel like I know these people. I'm just seeing them have emotions that previously it didn't really feel like they did. Yeah, I mean, I'll admit, I started a new job this past week. Last night, I was on a night shoot that kept me up until 4 a.m., so perhaps I'm just kind of tired and not in the right space for this movie when I watched it. But I was fighting off the land of Nod throughout a lot of this, and I thought it was a bit too long, personally. 2 out of 5 for Stalingrad.
The land of Nod. Oh, man. Well, I'm actually somewhat relieved that Zach is talking on this as much as he is, because I had similar complaints. Perhaps slightly less harsh, maybe only for diplomatic reasons. But I gave this a 2.5. I was coming off a decent night's sleep, but maybe was a little jet lagged. But I don't know. I hadn't seen a ton of movies in the past week, so usually that's when I'm like primed to enjoy the experience. I think in addition to Zach's boredom complaint, which I would echo, I felt like I had trouble not just investing in the characters, but also distinguishing between them. I guess by the third act, we kind of get the sense of this group of like 4 or so of them and some rough idea of the dynamics between them. And it's not unusual to watch a film and then not be able to recall characters' names, but I couldn't name anyone. The only actor I could really name is Kretschmann, and mostly for the reasons Zach made a joke of at the beginning. And I don't know. I think also this might be sort of a like sociological cultural difference more than anything else. But I thought that the way that Stalingrad set about depicting the Nazis, I don't necessarily take issue with it on the level of the idea, but more so of the execution. I feel like they're trying to sort of show the Nazis as soldiers. Like the sort of ideology of Nazism is not really explored at all in this movie, which is a choice. But I feel like if the goal of the film is to depict that human suffering and what those soldiers went through, sort of absent of their ideological thrust, maybe then Zach's complaints of middling characterization and involvement, maybe those things become more important, even if this is such a historical film. So I don't know. I give it a 2.5. I was sort of struggling to dig into it, and I felt like I appreciated certain moments. I also think the stream we watched, we all watched the same source of this.
Yes, I think we did.
Yeah.
It claimed to be an HD video. I felt that it was probably at best DVD quality, even though YouTube claimed it was 1080p. So, you know,
don't worry, the 4K restoration came out in 2021.
No way.
I'll let you know when it's discounted.
I will say in response to Christian's comments about the lack of kind of comment on Nazism, I think maybe more than a movie about Nazis and World War II, this is kind of trying to be a movie about the generation that went off to war, the boys that went off to war. In the same way that, like, in the US we have Band of Brothers, and that's a story about the boys who went off to war and those who came back and those who didn't. And I think Germany's generation of boys who went off to war just so happen to have fought for the Nazi party in this context. It's a weird needle to thread, I think, but I think it's more about like the generation and the young men that suffered and died than it is about the futility of the Nazi party and the message of Nazism.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very, very intrigued. Where to start? where to cook right now? I will say I really enjoyed this movie. I really enjoyed this. I enjoyed it, and yes, Zach, I did enjoy those battle scenes, and I knew exactly what was going on.
I had a
now,
feeling.
I'm no expert on Soviet history. I would say I might know a bit more about the Soviet Union at this time than I do about Japan, but I'm definitely familiar with the historical context and with I'll basically dive into what the general controversy about this film is that prevails a lot, especially on Reddit, apparently.
Oh.
It's the clean Wehrmacht myth. And I've mentioned this before. I think I've mentioned this before, but the clean Wehrmacht myth is kind of like Germany's equivalent of our lost cause, where there's a lot of people for many decades, and it kind of actually started mainly with the U.S. and with the Nuremberg trials, because in the Cold War, there's a lot of perpetuating of this belief that the Wehrmacht and the SS were completely separate, and that the Wehrmacht was essentially the equivalent of every other country's military at the time, and that because they were under the nation's flag and they were established under the government as opposed to the actual party, and they weren't necessarily directly under Hitler, that they were immediately like abstaining or not knowing or somehow completely away from all the atrocities. And this literally happened. This actually got worse in West Germany specifically for the longest time. It was used mainly as propaganda against the East Germans, who were constantly, to this day, by the way, Russians calling Germans and the West like Nazi affiliated or Nazis, and kind of using the past of World War II as like a propaganda tool for both sides. And this happened up until like 1995, which is where there's a group of historians and researchers that came together and proved to everybody they had thousands of documents and pictures and photos of Wehrmacht soldiers, all from all parts of the branches, engaging in atrocities and assisting the Einsatzgruppen and the SS death squads and the Gestapo, and it's just like it's very clear that like millions of the Wehrmacht definitely were somehow perpetuating or affiliated with the Nazi Party. Now, on the flip side of the coin, we're talking about like over 10 million people conscripted in the army, and they were conscripted; they weren't volunteers. So, a lot of the mainline infantry, the Heer infantry, a majority of them anyway, were not registered party members. They were not Nazis by general definition. They were obviously countrymen. A lot of them knew about the atrocities, but it's just like every other country in the sense that there's a wide range of beliefs in this. Now, obviously, we're talking about like one of the worst ideologies in human existence, so it's like the range is very big. There wasn't exactly like a whole bunch of Wehrmacht soldiers like putting down their weapons and kind of acting like the lieutenant in the movie, Hirschman, is like screaming and yelling about the treatment of POWs and everything. That is kind of silly. Okay, that's silly because everybody knows that there was an anti-Judeo-Bolshevik cause, right? Now, historically, the Sixth Army in particular was completely devolved and completely reconstructed by 1943 because a majority of the Holocaust adjacent acts that were committed against ethnic groups were done during Operation Barbarossa and during the first couple years of the war. So by this point, especially considering the characters in our film are coming from Africa, where it's like not even comparable. Like there weren't 100% atrocities committed in Africa, but it wasn't nearly to the extent or to the ideological extent in Europe. Completely not even comparable. So they're coming directly from Africa and getting put into this massive, like literally historic, gigantic, biggest, costliest battle ever, pretty much on a whim. And I feel like that was probably purposeful. And I do think there's a massive cultural distinction there because a lot of cultural Germans are going into this completely indoctrinated, not going to say indoctrinated, but completely shoved down their throats their entire childhood about how terrible the Holocaust was. That's literally like most of German history classes are about World War II. So there's definitely that cultural consideration. I will say that was probably my biggest criticism of the film, is that there's a little bit too much of the possibility that the clean Wehrmacht myth could be perpetuated. There's a lot of historians that argue that the film is like straight up just a clean Wehrmacht perpetuating film because it doesn't at all address the atrocities, so therefore it's guilty. But I'm definitely going to side with Zach on the points he made about the film being more about the soldier experience. And I feel like using Stalingrad as a background for that is definitely a very great idea. Because if it was earlier in the war and there was a lot of these like SS death squads hanging around and especially in Eastern Europe where a lot of the camps were actually set up and developed, and the Wehrmacht definitely were a part of setting them up, that would be a lot worse of an atrocity. Now, all of this requires historical context, so definitely a detriment of the film in that regard. But I will say, I really enjoyed the battle scenes. They were very great, very realistic. I felt like the film in general was not really taking a side on anything. I was kind of surprised that there was this amount of screen time given for the Soviet soldiers and having them talk. And I thought it was kind of interesting, creative choice not to have subtitles for them, because I would have kind of wondered what they were saying. I mean, you can kind of get it half the time what they're trying to get at. But I thought that was definitely an intriguing choice. I'll say that I was not necessarily emotionally invested in the characters in the same way that you would for other anti-war films, where you're fully sympathizing with them, because they definitely were 100% a part of war crimes in the film. They're using, basically it's the just following orders approach with everything, because they were obviously very reluctant to carry them out, but they did them anyway. So therefore they're responsible for them. And I thought that is a very, very unique perspective that isn't really seen. I mean, it can't really be talked about by other countries, and especially at this scale. I mean, this is a pretty historic event when it comes to civilian casualties. It's like over 3 million that were killed in this entire battle. So I feel like it was important for that to be a part of it. It's hard to cover this entire battle too, but I really appreciate the amount of, not only like the historical accurate things, obviously all the equipment was great and the uniforms were great. Okay. but the actual forms of battling, the way that they were fighting, and the general production was really great. I feel like contrasting like the muddy fogginess of the actual urban areas, and then using the outskirts as the main kind of area for the rest of the film was really great. Kind of showing those winter scenes are kind of what make the battle so iconic in history, is having that the Germans consistently losing in every regard by the time winter comes around. And I just, it was, I think it was a really great portrayal for what resources they had, and the level of detail they had when it came to the conversations they were having. And like I said, I'll actually echo a little bit of what Christian said, because I too kind of feel a little bit of a cultural disconnection from this, because it's kind of hard to relate to them in a multitude of ways, but it's also hard to kind of understand like what their home life was like, because this was definitely made for Germans. I feel like it's kind of made for audiences that are German or have some like Western European influence, and I think that can definitely narrow down the audience a lot as well.
Yeah.
But overall, I thought the battle scenes were awesome. I thought they were really, really well shot. I mean, there's a lot of use of different weapons. It didn't really feel stale when it came to what was happening, like the types of explosions they were using, and the types of they went from trench warfare to like room to room type combat. They had a little bit of not hand to hand, but like melee combat, and it was just incorporating a lot of the battle's like iconic aspects and the war's aspects in general. So as far as a war film goes, I really thought it was great. I definitely think there's a lot of controversial things about it. Is there anything that's kind of become apparent to you guys since I've talked about this? I didn't intend to make this a massive history lesson, but I also think it offers a different perspective to have the context. I don't think I'm going to change your opinions about it, but
I do sometimes feel like we should have footnotes in the comments down below for your episodes.
Only for my episodes,
because we get so much history out of them.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I do think it's interesting to hear that this is almost like the gods and generals of German war films. I don't know if that's a film you guys have seen, but it's like a spin-off of Gettysburg, which is about the Confederates, and very much covers kind of that lost cause narrative, and is a very polarizing film for that reason. But I think you've kind of proved the point that I made, where I think a lot of what you mentioned liking was the combat and the accuracy of the locations and the accuracy of the battles and the vehicles and the weaponry and things like that. And as someone who's not as into that, I felt a little bit stranded in this film. I said in my Letterboxd review that it was like watching somebody else play Risk for 2.5 hours. Because at a certain point, watching somebody else play Risk is kind of cool, because the miniatures are neat, and it's fun to see them have like tactics and how battles go. And then very quickly, if you're not playing and aren't actively invested in it, you're like, all right, well, Is something else going to happen? And I did kind of feel that way throughout a lot of this movie. I'd be intrigued to see. I read that this is only the second German film ever made about Stalingrad, and that the first one was made in like the 50s and was called Dogs, Do You Want to Live Forever or something like that. I'd be very intrigued to see that film, considering it came out so soon, relatively at least, after the end of the war in Germany, and see how the lens on the conflict is different there and addressed differently compared to this film.
Oh wait, I'll say one thing. Zach. Say one thing. About the guns and stuff that are awesome. I'll say something. All right. I will say that it's difficult to, in general, I'm going to sound like Kamala Harris or something. It's going to be like a very general statement or something. But we live in the context in which we live.
Okay.
We exist in the context in which we live. But I will say that...
Put a lime green filter over this part of the YouTube episode.
Yeah. Tim Wallace, come out. Please help me. So I will say that it depicts the conflict in a very raw manner, where the emotional realism to me is more important than the emotional investment, if that makes sense, because I feel as though they're reacting fairly realistically to the situations. Like we don't necessarily get more of their personalities about how they grew up or things that individualize them. I feel like we're meant to perceive them as having their own collectivist mindset and being victims to the machine that they're a part of. Now, on paper, that sounds really bad. Now I'm saying out loud, I'm like, wow, that's out of all the militaries in the world, right? To have that, like, oh, they're just following orders. But I've already discussed it. So, but yeah, I think that's where it comes for me. I'm not emotionally invested in them succeeding. I'm emotionally invested in the conflict that they're a part of, and seeing how their psychology devolves over time, because I do think that is something that progresses, not necessarily their opinions or like what they think about the war or how they feel about life in general. I feel like we get more of like the shell-shocked perspective, where it's like everything's just completely gone to heck and there's no reason to exist anymore. They constantly talk about like, I don't want to live, like, let me get out of here. Because in reality, soldiers that are conscripted, it's not necessarily they're coming out with like high school degrees or college degrees or something. I mean, a lot of them have almost no concept of ideology to begin with. So they're just coming into this war with like hearing one or two things on the news and then immediately going into the war. And then they're introduced to this absolute like horror. And I think there's something to be said about that.
I think in terms of realism versus relation, I understand what you're saying, Mitchell, but I do think that realism, that emotional realism, would resonate more strongly if we knew more about them. I think this is kind of what I was worried Gallipoli was going to be like, where the entire movie is just the battle. And I do think maybe there's some fair comparison between those two, because in Gallipoli, our characters obviously aren't fighting for the Nazis, but they're similarly, as is the case here, they're involved in a conflict that they don't really care about and don't really understand. And they're there for a reason they can't really comprehend. And I think the reason that works so much in Gallipoli is because we know so much about them and we know them as people, versus here where we kind of only know them as soldiers within a unit.
Yeah, I think you guys have covered that humanity point pretty well. I think from the historical angle, maybe just in my partial defense, even though I've complained here and there about World War II or war film fatigue, I think most of the time my sort of reticence with the genre or overexposure has been proven to be wrong. Most recently with when we did Conspiracy, probably, but I'm sure there are plenty of other examples where I've been like, oh, another one of these, and then it turns out to be really good. I think maybe I was also a little bit bothered, even like accepting this historical angle. I felt like we didn't always get a full sense of the scope of Stalingrad or the war. There is that one scene which is sort of effective where they're in this large room where everybody is freaking wounded and dying, and then one of them goes crazy. And this is, I don't know how realistic this was, Mitchell, but he like points a gun at a doctor and is like, "Help my friend, dang it." And I feel like you get at least some sense of the bloodiness of the conflict in that moment. But I mean, you hear like, and then at the very end of the film, you get that like sort of typical these are the numbers thing about the actual conflict. But like to me, the film should represent that more. Like there are estimated to be hundreds of thousands of men that were never recovered, and I feel like maybe in focusing on these four guys, you kind of lose a sense of the scale of the casualties and the conflict. And maybe if we're accepting this as a historical focus, which okay, I think that's defensible to some extent. Maybe the response then is to include more characters and to not spend so much time with these men that you weren't going to spend that time characterizing them more, if that makes sense. I don't know.
I think maybe to defend that a little bit, that aspect of the film, I think maybe that comes down to this being a movie made by Germans for German viewers.
Sure.
Because I think maybe Stalingrad is much more of a culturally ingrained conflict for a lot of Germans. I'm just speculating at this point, but I feel like maybe that's the case where, you know, it's assumed the viewers kind of already know about a lot of this and have learned about it in school, and so we're seeing it from a more intimate perspective. This is probably kind of a po-faced comparison, but I don't know. I'm reminded of movies like Oliver Stone's World Trade Center, which is about 9/11, but it's told entirely from the perspective of firemen who are trapped under the towers. And so you don't see big things like the towers collapsing and people running through the streets, because it's about telling the story of this culturally ingrained thing in America that we've all seen footage of and know about from a much more intimate perspective that maybe we hadn't thought of before. I feel like maybe that's the case with what this movie is trying to do. Because I think there's other movies that I think a movie that maybe has more in common with what you were thinking of in terms of portrayal of the conflict would be something like Enemy at the Gates, where we see lots of wide shots of armies fighting each other and cars flipping over and thousands of people dead on the ground. And I don't think this movie is necessarily as interested in that side of it.
I guess you're both pretty much saying similar thing. I think you're both saying that it's trying to do both at the same time. Because I feel like Christian is saying that the film's like itching to show more of the conflict and is trying to be a historical film, but it's focusing on these goobers and not talking about them or anything. And Zach is saying that is what the film is. It's about this intimate relationship with these characters, but there's not enough human development to be interested in them.
Yeah.
Is pretty much what you're saying.
I think that's correct, yeah.
I disagree. but
with respect, you are both wrong.
I'm glad I understand. I have to mention the score. I think the score, I had to get a little bit used to it, honestly. I feel like there was a few moments where that helped the overzealousness of the sympathy. And I'm also intrigued because knowing a little bit about German culture, there's a lot of blunt punctuality when it comes to not only the way they're talking, but the way the movie's freaking edited. Because we will literally go from one scene to the next. Sometimes the camera pans down for a split second before it actually cuts over to the next scene. I noticed that like 3 times, which is very weird. But overall, it's kind of the same thing. Like the score immediately starts and it gets crazy, like a crescendo, and then it goes down. So what did you guys think of the score and the editing?
The score feels very made for TV to me. I am not really a musician. The only thing I can play is the harmonica, and that not very well. But it does feel quite small and tinny, and maybe that's just the result of where we watched this. But it doesn't. It feels very very MIDI to me. It feels like it was made on like an early DAW, and there were no real instruments in the booth for any of it.
That is hilarious. There are parts of it that feel that MIDI way to me, but I think where it maybe doesn't work for me is it does feel orchestral to me, at least at the outset, and then they're kind of like big, like bonk bonk type moments that feel like they come off of instruments that aren't real. But again, that might just be chalked up to a cultural difference. We talked about to reference Gallipoli again. There are a couple like very synth heavy moments in Gallipoli that seemed, I think, odd to all three of us.
Yeah.
But were probably less odd to Australian moviegoers at the time.
Yeah.
So,
or even just people in the 80s.
Yeah. That's where I was going. So I don't know. I think it undercuts the drama at certain points. It's not terrible, but something I feel more often that like the more I watch movies, the more I'm like a score should actively enhance the scene or it shouldn't be there. Almost like the same this ideology I have is like Zach's ideology about scenes. Like if it's not furthering the plot or characters, it's fat and it needs to be cut.
Yeah. I like the score sometimes. I like the bass of the synth sometimes. Like in the background, we're like bee, bee, bee. like the basketball scene from Regular Show. It's like we're going into Stalingrad, boys. Let's go.
It's gonna be the craziest connection we've ever had. Stalingrad.
But yeah, I don't know. I thought it was interesting. I feel like war films, especially at this time, you had to be very careful with including too much pop culture in the film when it comes to music, because I think the more synth it starts to really degrade the source material, I guess. Thinking of things.
There is.
Go ahead, Zach. Go ahead.
I was going to say, in looking up details about this film, and there have obviously been a lot of films about Stalingrad, but there is apparently a big, like, multi-hour, epic-length Russian film about Stalingrad from, like, 2013. And I'd be quite curious to see that, because that's kind of in, like, the verging on all Russian cinema is propaganda era of Russian pop culture. But I'm kind of morbidly curious to see what a Russian Stalingrad movie from that era looks like, and how that spin on the conflict is portrayed in order to promote the Russian government and Putin and his bear or whatever.
This is the freaking poster.
It looks like the
pretty
poster
epic.
like RRR or something.
Yeah. I was gonna say it looks like the 2012 Avengers poster. RDJ's like holding his hand up. Mitchell, you kind of gave us more like historical context for this, but I kind of wanted to follow up about this whole. There's this clear disconnect between the goobers, as you put it, and their the higher ranks folks. And we sort of alluded to it, but it does feel like to some extent there is this idea that the soldiers are just following orders or are innocent from Nazism. And I do think it helps that they're obviously facing up against Stalin, who himself is not a moral paragon. So, but I don't know. I guess I just wanted to ask you guys if that affected your viewing experience. I've sort of already said how I felt the way that the film sort of skirts over Nazism as an ideology is distracting. And Zach mentioned how these characters, like the characters in Gallipoli, don't seem to be fully aware of the conflict or what it is they're fighting for. But then there are still moments where, like, I don't know, maybe this is a sort of a sardonic, like, this means nothing to me moment, but the guy says Heil Hitler before killing himself. I still feel like there are these moments in there where maybe they're empty recitations of Hitler, or there's that one hilarious speech about defending a Western Christian values against Eastern Bolshevism, which got a chuckle out of me. But I don't know. I guess just a broader question of this rank difference and the idea of these main characters being blameless or close to blameless did that work for you guys?
I it's not something I found distracting, but it is something that I found myself kind of like forgetting and then re-realizing at different bits of the movie.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I am gonna say sometimes we say like, oh, maybe it's a cultural difference, but I do really think that might be down to a cultural difference and just how the relationship that Germany has with Nazism in its history and how that's kind of an inescapable thing. I think that's something that any German viewer going into this is going to be very aware of in
Mhm.
a very different way to the way that we are, where I don't think that's going to be something that maybe it feels like the film is trying to push against it. I feel like maybe to German viewers that's kind of a shadow that consistently hangs over the whole film, and maybe some new kind of emotional reaction comes out of that we just can't tap into because we don't have that kind of history and education and experience as Americans. But that also might be me giving the film way too much credit and taking it entirely on face value. I'm really not sure. I'm kind of stumped by that one, if I'm honest.
All right. That never
Nothing.
happens.
Nothing. Yeah, right. Nothing. I can't say anything for sure because even looking up like Vilsmeyer, the director, it's very hard to find anything on him. And I did go out of my way to find like German criticism of this film, and it's very hard to find because it's a very well received film in general by both critics and audiences. And they almost never bring up that critique either. And I mean, I'm coming from an American perspective too, and I do feel like it needs to be talked about. I feel like it to me, it's like really obvious. Like, how could you possibly talk about Germany and not mention this, right? But based on what I know, not that I've never been to Germany, I don't know anything. All right, I'm just speculating based on what I've known from like my own historical research and studies and everything, and interviews from Germans and general like investment in the culture. I think I have to agree with Zach that I think it's a cultural difference, and I'm always thinking about it. Like I'm always thinking about it. I'm always thinking about when it's going to get brought up or something. It did not bother me at all, but I will say one thing I did. This kind of segues into what I wanted to bring up too, is that they had the Russian soldier, the female Russian soldier that was with them for a good portion of it, and there's definitely an insinuation that she was used as a sex slave to some extent, and then we kind of see the lieutenant kind of go crazy on her, like pretty much ready to rape her and not, completely losing his marbles. And that was an interesting scene for me specifically because I was still completely stumped as to whether or not I was supposed to sympathize with him at all in that point, and whether or not I was supposed to either take the film at face value and kind of just take it as what we're watching, like they've experienced this conflict up to this point, we'll never be able to relate to them, so that all of the shell shock and everything that's happened has kind of brought out the worst in them. Or is this kind of like, are we meant to sympathize with them? Are we supposed to relate to this experience at all? Are we supposed to see any good in them and him eventually defending her and then kind of coming back around on it? And it's just like, I feel like it's got to be the first thing. I feel like we're not supposed to sympathize with them, and it's very difficult to say that when a lot of the film is about them, and that I can understand why that would demand emotional investment, but I do. It just comes back to our disagreement as to where the emotional investment is, basically. But yeah, to answer your question, Christian, it didn't really bother me that much. I think one fundamental thing that's kind of been in every anti-war film that's at all exploring the experience of the common like junior enlisted soldier or something, there's always going to be criticism of the officers. There's always going to be like that's a 100% stereotype, and I feel like they definitely went down on that hard in this one. They were way definitely like everything is the officer's fault and everything, and that's a very consistent criticism, especially in more authoritarian countries. That's something you see a lot more in anti-war films, where it's like the officers are the ones that are to blame for all this because they're the ones directly responsible for us. And as somebody who's a part of the U.S. Army, I understand that perspective, why the officers are to blame for everything. But I know I made that comparison. But I once again think it falls into what Zach was talking about with like the soldiers coming home. It's less about seeing them as humans and more seeing them as soldiers that have suffered under this regime for no reason, and that they've been completely subjugated to these horrors with that they were not at all expecting or at all wanting to be a part of from the beginning. And I thought that is what makes this film far more unique than pretty much any other anti-war film. But yeah, it's a matter of perspective. I can see why it would bother you, and I think there's something to be said about it. But I will. It goes back to what I was saying about the Stalingrad thing. Like, it's not really the best conflict to explore Nazism about, honestly. Maybe the anti-Slavic kind of the overzealous culture and super like total war scenario ideology when it comes to being anti-Bolshevik and anti-Slavic and anti-Jewish and everything, anti-intellectual. All of that was very much in the beginning stages of the war when it comes to like enforcing the ideology on a grand scale. And I think like even with the Warsaw ghettos was just in 1943, just before this. So I mean that was kind of one of the pinnacles of the Holocaust and everything. But all of that is almost completely not really involved in this stage of the conflict when it comes to the invasion of Stalingrad. It was kind of all hands on deck. So, but like I said before, it depends on the context you have and how much you know about history. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe
in its partial defense. Oh, sorry, Zach.
I was just going to say, I've been thinking about this. Maybe the most comparable thing for this film that we can directly relate to in America would be, and it's kind of a weak comparison, but I think of something like The Deer Hunter, where that's a movie where they don't really discuss or acknowledge why America is in Vietnam at all. It's entirely just about the boys that went over there, and they don't acknowledge some of the atrocious things that happened during that war. It's entirely just about the boys that are over there and how the conflict affects them. And I wonder if maybe someone from Germany saw The Deer Hunter, they would go, well, why don't they talk about why America's there at all? Why don't they talk about the motivations of their country at all? And I think it's because it's something in America that we know because that's part of our cultural history. Maybe that's comparable. I'm trying to
Rambo.
Yes, Rambo Part 2.
Yeah. They committed war crimes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the closest thing I can think of that might be a comparison for kind of an American version of this kind of portrayal.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in the film's partial defense, I don't think it needs necessarily to be a condemnation of Nazism merely because it depicts that conflict. And I think there are valid ways in which to illustrate that push-pull between commander and soldier and the morality that results from that. I just wasn't sure how much that worked for me in this instance, but I think I'm willing to accept the whole lack of investment angle.
Final thoughts.
Well, I didn't particularly enjoy it, but I am glad I watched it. It's no Das Boot, but I do think it's interesting to see films like this that portray a conflict that we feel so familiar with, but from a totally different perspective. I always think that is interesting to see. And so I'm glad you picked it for the show, Mitchell, even if it didn't quite end up being a hit. Thank you.
Me too.
Yeah, it's an interesting addition to our oeuvre of World War II.
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like there's like sort of like a long list of things that weren't quite met, as opposed to like one huge big thing that it doesn't do for me. But 2.5. I respect what it's going for. And I hate to circle back to this. I feel like I'm becoming like the physical media snob on this podcast. but I really do feel like the like picture quality and compression of sound, whether I state that explicitly or not, I feel like it does have a significant impact on my enjoyment or assessment of the material. I
Yeah.
think it did on All That Jazz too. Like
Hmm.
I seriously think if I had used a Blu-ray, it might have been a 4 for me. But just a note for audience members that are hearing this and thinking about watching it, it might be worth looking for a higher quality version of it if you
Mhm.
think this is something you'll really like or is worthwhile.
I wonder why you've taken on this mantle, Christian. As opposed, it
know.
might be that I watch way more crap than you, where even in like a really restored version, it's like doesn't look that good. So maybe I'm just more used to that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think I've been worn down by the like 2B streams I've watched for the podcast.
Yeah.
Never again, man.
Yeah, it's like "Wir hatten Entdeckung, los," and then it's like, do you want to learn Coding Academy Python? the ads
The
are crazy.
subtitles seemed like they weren't perfect either.
Yeah, I feel like tell me if I'm wrong, Zach. I feel like that's a common freaking trend with like 80s and 90s foreign films when it comes to translations, or in general, not very good.
Definitely on what I think probably was the case here is that there was a German DVD that had an English subtitle track. And that is probably what we watched. And so I imagine American movies, the subtitle track for like Spanish or German is not always directly in sync, and we just don't notice because we're not using them. Yeah. I think that the shoe might have been on the other foot in more than one way for this film.
Well, don't worry. There's an English dub out there somewhere.
Oh.
In case you ever want to revisit this, you can really have a good time. Then I'll give it a 2.
We have to get into Stalingrad.
No. That'd be such a good time. All right, I don't have anything else to say. I've had my fill today. 4 out of 5, epic movie. All right, weekend review. Go ahead.
Well, I think I have a weirdly appropriate contribution for weekend review. I didn't think of this until just now, because I have continued to read. I mentioned, I've continued to read. I did not stop since the last time I talked about a book on this show. Good for me. I get a gold star. Anyway, I think last year on the podcast, during one of our weekend review installations, I talked about the Doctor Who new adventure novel, Theater of War. And this is basically a book series after Doctor Who was canceled in 1989 that continued the canon through books for many years. And I enjoyed that book. I enjoyed Theater of War by Justin Richards. I gave it a 9 out of 10. And I've continued to read those books since because there are a lot of them. They published like 2 a month until the 1996 TV movie came out. So that's 7 years worth of 2 a month books. And lately I read the novel Toy Soldiers by Paul Leonard, which is about this kind of intergalactic conflict, this infinite war that's being spurred on by a computer that is pulling people from different parts of time and space to take part in the war because the conflict must go on. And it's a good premise for a Doctor Who story, but it kind of scuppers out in the back half like a lot of these Doctor Who new adventures do. A lot of these novels were written by fan fiction writers, which is something that I think is actually quite neat because in the late 80s, early 90s, the BBC did not care about Doctor Who at all. So they gave the book license to Virgin Media, and the head of Virgin Publishing went to the fans and said, "Hey, you've written a lot of fan fiction in these like fan published zines and magazines. Would you like to write a book?" And so a lot of writers kind of got their first shot at writing a novel as like late teens or early 20-year-olds. People our age got to write official Doctor Who media. And I think that's very cool and not something that you would see happening now. But that means that a lot of them are pretty bad. And Toy Soldiers is unfortunately one of them. This current point in the series also suffers from, there are these 2 new companions that have been introduced named Chris and Roz, who are like space marines. They're part of a police force from the future, which is interesting in the book when they're introduced. But the way that the new adventures worked is because they had such a constant cycle, people were writing their books at the same time. So by the time they decided that these 2 were going to be new companions, there were like 8 other books in the pipeline that were almost finished that they hadn't been written into yet. So they were introduced like 3 or 4 books ago. And every book that I've read since, they have been like off on their own little fetch quest or locked in a cupboard or unconscious for basically the whole story. And it really just it feels like such a drag because in this book there's a conflict happening on another planet with the Doctor and Bernice, who's the main companion at this point. And then we have to cut back every couple of chapters to Chris and Roz, who are flying a biplane across the French Channel for some reason. So 5 out of 10 for Doctor Who Toy Soldiers. I am going to continue reading these books and collecting these books because I like having them. They're neat collector's items. But I have no illusions about how good a lot of them are. I think maybe I can count on one hand the number of genuinely great new adventures that I have read, and I have read almost 30 at this point.
Wow. I admire your commitment. There was a time where I was locked into reading like every single Star Wars canon novel, and I semi-recently gave up because they're, like you said, they're not all that great.
Yeah.
Why is it that you give books ratings out of 10 and movies out of 5?
I don't always. I give Doctor Who ratings out of 10 because I give television ratings out of 10 because I think it better reflects, like in a season of TV, there's so much variety to like different episodes, and there can be so many kinds of different episodes, especially in a show like Doctor Who, which is very episodic. So I do that to reflect the show because this is a continuation of the show. But most books I rate out of 5.
Fair enough.
A novel is out of 5, but a series is out of 10.
Indubitably.
Yeah, I'm in a weird spot here. I've only watched like 6 different things since our last episode, and most of them are shorts, a rewatch, or Stalingrad.
Time to talk about the LSAT, Christian.
Yeah, no. And the other things I watched were both boring, but this might have been a rewatch. I'm honestly not sure, but I logged it as a watch because I couldn't remember. I watched A Bug's Life.
Oh, yeah.
It's a peculiar film. It's a weird place for the history of computer animation and Pixar as a studio.
Mm-hmm.
It's their second feature, the second directed by John Lasseter, who is now sort of disgraced. He left Pixar after he was accused of like inappropriate touching by some people, which is yeesh. And I think unfortunately that made this viewing experience a little bit odder having that in context now, because there's some humor in Bug's Life that sort of pushes the envelope of things that were maybe more acceptable in the late 90s than they are now.
Yeah.
Like there's a whole troupe of circus performers, and one of the character gags is that the ladybug is actually a man, but everybody assumes that the ladybug is a woman because it's a ladybug, and so there are flies at this show like catcalling the ladybug, and he gets upset, and the flies are like, "Oh my God, it's a man! Oh, how have we made this mistake?" And it's like,
Christian
"Oh,
laughed.
man."
He laughed.
I laughed and then I grimaced. And then I was like, oh, this is so John Lasseter in maybe not great ways.
Darn.
And the animation still has this sort of like iffy feel to it. It's still very early for computer animation. And the voice actors it's weird, man. I don't know who Dave Foley is. I guess he was a comedian, but
He's a kid in the hall.
Ant.
Kids in the hall, man.
I know nothing, Zach. Kevin Spacey is the villain, Hopper, which is hilarious because it doesn't sound like him at all to me. And then Julia Louis-Dreyfus is the princess Ant, because why not? I give this a 2.5. I thought it was kind of weird, and especially looking at it next to other Pixar films, which I generally admire, it was hard to ignore the faults here. I do think it's worth some credit for its genuinely not aspirational, but daring, let's say, exploration of class politics, because the characters give some really big speeches, and Hopper in particular is like, if the ants realize they outnumber us by so much, we're doomed, but we rule over them with fear, and it's like, oh, okay. But it's still kind of a shrug-worthy movie. I didn't really care about any of the characters, and it doesn't look great. And the comedy is very hit or miss for me. It's very John Lasseter, for reasons good and bad. 1998, and you can tell. So 2.5.
So this is your least favorite adaptation of The Seven Samurai?
Or the Three
Wow.
Amigos.
You just blew my mind, Zach. Oh my god. Oh no. Yes, it is my That's insane. Oh, I don't like that at all.
I have a better adaptation. It's called the best adaptation of NSYNC's "Bye Bye Bye" music video.
Oh
You
my
couldn't
god.
possibly guess. Couldn't possibly
Oh
guess what
my
film I'm
God.
talking about.
Oh my god.
All right, all right. First of all, no spoilers. Okay, I'll be careful. No spoilers. Okay, I promise. Deadpool and Wolverine. All right, all right, all right, all right. Everybody, settle down. Settle down. Shut up, critics. I know you hate Marvel now, and shut up, audience. I know you hate Marvel now, but don't worry. This is the unifying. This is our Marvel
Uh-oh.
Jesus, as they say in the movie. And
Oof.
I thought it was all right. Honestly, I thought it was good. And this is definitely a case of critics versus audience, where it is very much pandering to audience expectation. And it uses the MCU formula. It really does. It uses it in how it basically uses it to converge Deadpool and the Fox Marvel film era films, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. It's a send off to those eras of films of X-Men, etc., of that generation. And there are obviously a lot of cameos in the film, and I enjoyed the cameos. I enjoyed the way they were inserted. I thought a lot of the quips were very entertaining. I found myself more entertained than Deadpool 2, probably. And I think now if I watched all three in a row, I think I would like this one the best. But looking back, I remember seeing Deadpool and being absolutely like ecstatic. I was super into it. It was super funny. And I don't think the novelties necessarily wear it off. And I do think that having Wolverine in this is a very good addition. Having that buddy cop kind of formula here definitely works. And they're both at Reynolds and Jackman are 100% at the top of their game. There's no sense of that they don't want to be in this film. It's a full commitment. And I do have to say, this is an MCU formulaic film, okay? No matter how many times they say in the film, making fun of the freaking universe and making fun of how everybody hates Marvel in the film does not excuse the mistakes that have been made, the horrors that have been produced after Endgame. There is nothing that will ever correct that, right? So I do think this is kind of a very meta type film where it's like, oh, we all know, like, it's breaking the eighth wall, where it's like, we all know that everybody doesn't like Marvel movies, so we're going to do the same thing again because it's Deadpool and I can do what I want. That's pretty much the perspective of Deadpool the whole time. That's pretty much the line of jokes always end up going back to that at some point. At that point, it kind of becomes a matter of preference. Kind of, what are you looking to get out of the film? I don't think it's a great, massively well-made film. It's not reviving the MCU. I can tell you that right now. It's not. But I think it is definitely very entertaining. I think Ryan Reynolds had a huge part, and probably Hugh Jackman had a huge part in the script here. And I think they really knew what jokes to tell. And I think, but combined with the cameos, which do become a part of the very thin plot line towards the end, I do think they're very entertaining. And I don't feel like I was clapping like a seal or anything. I mean, I wasn't clapping, but metaphorically clapping like a seal when I was seeing these cameos. But I think it works in the context of Deadpool. I think it does. I think I'm willing to go as far as to justify it to that point. But it's still a Marvel film. It's still an MCU film. The writers have not changed. Okay, this is not like all of a sudden we figured out the key golden formula, how to break out of this endless tirade. but I think it was enjoyable. I think if you know what you're getting into, I think it's a good film. It's definitely a 3 for me. A very solid 3. And I think there's nothing that it could have done to go beyond that for me.
Wow.
So
I haven't seen it. I have seen a lot of spoilers. I've seen way too many trailers for it.
Yeah.
And I gotta be honest, man. I feel like if I saw it, I would really dislike it. I feel like
Yeah.
it ruins the legacy of Logan. But again,
Mhm.
this is coming from a decent amount of distance. But I don't know. It feels really like a product to me now, and maybe that's fine, and maybe it would be entertaining. But
Mhm.
I'm nervous for this. I'm gonna watch it when it's on Disney Plus to review it. But
It's gonna be on
don't
Disney
know.
Plus. I guess it has to be.
Someday.
It's
yeah,
all the things that are on Disney Plus. I was trawling through Disney Plus the other day, and like all the Alien and Predator movies are on Disney Plus.
yeah, yeah.
This is
Weird,
more
man.
gory than both of those.
Wow.
All of those, by the way. It's pretty crazy how gory it is. Also, massively overhyped. I don't know if I even need to say that. Obviously, this was overhyped. But yeah, I thought it was funny. I was genuinely laughing quite a few times. And I did not have high hopes. But yeah, I don't believe anybody that's giving this a 1 or a 4. I can tell you right now. If you give it a 1 or a 4, I automatically hate you.
Oh my goodness.
I'll give it a 1.5.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting. I'm just looking at the writers, and Sean Levi and Ryan Reynolds are both credited as writers,
Okay.
as well as Zeb Wells, who did some Robot Chicken stuff,
Oh yeah. Okay.
and Paul Wernick, who wrote the first 2 and Zombieland and a couple other things. So
Okay.
interesting because it was
I
made
can see
during the
that.
writer's strike. But yeah,
Oh. Huh.
I don't know.
You can't have a multiverse movie and have them make fun of the multiverse in the movie. It's not possible. That's the last thing I'll say.
Agreed.
I think maybe it was possible.
Maybe in your dimension, Zach.
Oh yes. Here in
Maybe
in the
Bender Earth
Garrigus verse,
616. Yeah, the Garrigus verse.
Dimension ZG, Dimension City Mist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Welcome to the rundown. You're joining at a bit of a low point. But this is a weird one because I think I'm starting this one instead of Mitchell. So there.
Wow.
Oh,
Yeah.
is that a
That's
first?
how we're
this-
going to change things
this
up.
season?
Christian's the one ordering me, and I'm the one that's firing on Zach as he's screaming at me, telling me not to shoot at him across the snow bank.
Yeah.
Oh no! Why am I the worst one in that arrangement?
Yeah, it's fine.
Anyway, we're going to start in 3, 2, 1, go. Defending Western Christian values against Eastern Bolshevism.
2 out of 5.
Faster and hands up.
3 out of 5.
Shooting your friend.
2 out of 5.
Doing the same thing once.
3 out of 5.
German accents.
3 out of 5.
Protesting to Hitler.
4 out of 5.
No subtitles for Russian.
2 out of 5.
GGM.
3 out of 5.
Shooting the big guy.
3 out of 5.
Ivan Stove.
4 out of 5.
Not having to worry about sunburn.
4 out of 5.
Modeling for today's army.
2 out of 5.
Hearts are Trump translation.
3 out of 5.
Reading.
4 out of 5.
90s overture.
2 out of 5.
Throwing tires and drinking piss.
2 out of 5.
Heroes not being late.
2 out of 5.
Teaching Ivan how to swim in the Volga.
3 out of 5.
Standard procedure.
3 out of 5.
Looking like a 3-year-old.
2 out of 5.
1 second. Breaking bread.
4 out of 5.
Time. Okay.
Oh, we got
That counts.
we got some good ones.
That counts.
Christian, I feel like you have to be putting these good ones at the end. I swear, they're so funny. Oh, shoot.
This
So
year,
freaking
there
funny.
have been. Yeah. This
Yeah.
one in particular has quite a few. Yeah. Who's next?
All right.
I don't remember.
am next. And so next time I will be bringing to the table a film that originally we thought might be the last one we covered this season. That may or may not be the case. It's to be determined. But so I had planned to go out on a bang. So next time we
no.
are going to be discussing the 1978 Ralph Bakshi animated version of Lord of the Rings.
Oh yeah.
This is a project that I have been fascinated with for a really long time. I really like Ralph Bakshi as an outside artist and a really forward-thinking cartoonist and filmmaker. I mean, he made the first X-rated cartoon, and then like 5 or 6 years later, he's making the first official adaptation of Lord of the Rings. So that's
crossover.
such a fascinating pipeline to me. I can't wait to discuss it. Next time we'll be talking about The Lord of the Rings from Ralph Bakshi. So tune in for that.
You better not have a single star associated with your liking of the lore, Zach, or your hypocrisy will show.
Yeah.
That's fair. Yeah.
You better get wrecked. Yeah. I've never seen this one, despite my love of the books and Jackson's movies. So looking forward to it.
All right.
All right. Auf Wiedersehen.